All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to NCVLI's Rise Project Facebook series. This has been a live series that we've conducted this week during National Crime Victims' Rights Week. I'm Jennifer Storm, a consultant with the National Crime Victim Law Institute and your host. We're excited that we've been able to come to you and celebrate National Crime Victims' Rights. We are now coming to the end of this amazing week. This year's theme has been rights, access, and equity for all. This year's theme really underscores the importance of helping crime survivors find justice by enforcing rights, expanding access to services, and ensuring equality and inclusion for all. The National Crime Victim Law Institute fields thousands of technical assistance requests annually, and we strongly encourage you to reach out to our staff anytime you are dealing with issues that speak to this theme, that speak to representation of crime victims, any questions you have, any concerns you have. NCVLI is an amazing group of individuals, the think tank that they are and that they have access to outside of the actual organization is absolutely incredible, and they are there and willing to help in any concerns or needs that you may have. So, like I said, it's Friday and it is our final day, and we're super excited to have with us. We're going to be traveling to Oregon, which is where our main office location for NCVLI is, and we're speaking with the amazing individuals of the Disability Rights Organization. This is Beth Brownhill and Eric Wilkinson, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But first, thank you. Welcome to our Facebook series. And thank you so much for all of the incredible work that you do. Would either of you, both of you, like to introduce yourselves and then maybe talk a little bit about your organization and what you do?
Sure, Jennifer, thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be here. I'm Beth Brownhill, and I'm an attorney with Disability Rights Oregon's Crime Survivor Project. We formed our project about a year ago to serve survivors of crime in Oregon who experience disabilities.
And I'm Allie Wilkinson, and I'm a staff attorney at Disability Rights Oregon's Crime Survivor Project, and I'm a former employee of the National Crime Victim Law Institute, so I have only good things to say about NCVLI. Thanks for including us.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, so let's dive in. This is, I think, a really important and timely conversation. Not only does it tie into the theme, but every day, this is such an important topic that we make sure that we are focusing on in our field. It's also, though, I think an area where a lot of folks don't have enough capacity and understanding. So what I'm hoping to get from today is kind of planting some seeds out there for the scope of the issue, and then ways that we can better serve and have better capacity to serve. So, are people with disabilities disproportionately impacted by crime?
Yes, and I can answer that. So just to put things in context a little bit, federally, nationally, the percentage of people with disabilities ranges from between 12.6 to 27.2%, depending on which statistics you're looking at. Here in Oregon, we have numbers of about 26.1%, depending on the county, and that's very dependent on how disability is defined. So we think that 12.6 definition is very constrictive, and even the 27.2%. I think many more people than that are actually living with disabilities. So people with disabilities are also disproportionately impacted by crime. And the numbers here are really very shocking. So people with developmental disabilities in particular are about 3 times more likely to be victims of violent crime within the past year than people without disabilities. And this one is really shocking, but 90% of people with developmental disabilities will be sexually assaulted in their lifetimes. And nearly half of those people will be abused more than 10 times. So we're talking about really chronic abuse. Some populations are even more at risk than others, in particular women and children and people of certain racial backgrounds. So women are 40% more likely to be victims of intimate partner violence than those without disabilities. And this one is also so shocking and sad, but up to 70% of women with disabilities are subject to some type of crime, financial, sexual, physical, emotional, just within the past year. So 7 out of 10 of all women with disabilities have had some sort of crime committed against them in the past year alone. And then children with disabilities are almost 3 times more likely to experience sexual abuse than children without disabilities. And not only that, and I know we're going to get to this a little bit and really soon, but with these shocking numbers and knowing how many people have disabilities, you would expect that you would see so many people with disabilities in the criminal justice system. But what we're finding is that that's just not true. And it's harder to find statistics on this, but we think that the number that we see, which is that less than 1% of reported crimes leads to conviction, is actually much higher than the actual statistic is.
I mean, I knew the scope of the problem was bad. Hearing those numbers, and then also knowing that they're disproportionately represented statistically, and the crimes that you've talked about, right? Rape, child abuse, even financial abuse and domestic violence are historically underreported crimes.
Mm-hmm.
That just tells me that those numbers are just, that it's just unacceptable, just devastating. So can you describe, obviously there's barriers, there has to be barriers, right? Because we're seeing such a discrepancy in impact versus access. So can you describe some of those barriers that people with disabilities face in accessing justice based on the work that you've done, obviously?
Yes, we can. And I mean, this is the important question to ask. What are the barriers and why? And we see that the reasons are multifaceted, that crimes are going unreported and under-investigated. It's important to know that people with disabilities are more likely to be abused by their caregivers, by their family members. And so naturally, fear, retaliation, or reprisal in reporting abuse. It's very hard to, in particular nowadays, to find caregiving. And so fear that if you report abuse, there won't be someone to take care of you. Also, people with disabilities may lack knowledge that what has happened to them is a crime. And this partly gets to the lack of appropriate sexual education in our schools for people who experience, in particular, developmental or intellectual disabilities. They're not given the language to speak out to support themselves. People with disabilities fear being disbelieved, and that they won't be found to be credible. And this is based in ableism and stigma and discrimination. And then people with disabilities face difficulty in accessing support services. They're not referred to our support services, so they don't have the supports in having their voice in making reports to begin with. And then it comes down to distrust of police for all of the reasons that I've just touched on. People are more afraid to turn to the police to file a report. They may have experienced abuse by police. They don't trust that their stories will be heard. I think it's also important to talk about why people with disabilities are underserved by support providers. And by support providers, I mean survivor services for domestic violence, sexual assault, but also for services for specifically for people with disabilities. They face communication barriers in accessing services. So services may not provide sign language interpreters. They may speak with the support of a support person or a communication device or board that's not, that support services can't support or access. And they may face physical barriers in accessing services. So a shelter, for example, may not have a wheelchair ramp or other necessary accommodations for survivors. And then there's prejudice about the ideal victim that is carried by our community and by support services in not supporting survivors with disabilities. And then I think also that we see support services may not be equipped in understanding the layers and the complexities of abuse against people with disabilities. We have worked with we're working with so many wonderful DVSA services across our state, but what we find is that there aren't services for the other types of abuse and crime that are committed against people with disabilities, such as financial abuse or physical neglect. Or physical abuse that's not DVSA. It's by a paid caregiver, not a family member.
Well, based on that data, right, that we just listened to, and the examples that you shared, which are really complex, and some of them, you often hear people say, well, every place is ADA compliant. Of course, every place is accessible. And people just assume because we've had these laws that everyone's in compliance or everyone has that accessibility. And obviously that is clearly not true. Victims and survivors with disabilities face a much higher rate of victimization, as you illustrated, Allie. Yet the crime services field really still lacks the capacity to adequately serve this group. And this is what also leads to underreporting and underreflection and lack of access. So why do you think this is?
Well, I think the first thing is that people are maybe afraid to even ask, do you have a disability? And we've seen that a lot. We've been asked that question a lot. How do you know if someone has a disability? And maybe it's because we are Disability Rights Oregon. We know that people coming to us have a disability, but we ask, do you identify as having a disability? Or if you don't feel comfortable, what do you need and how can we help you get the services that you need? So it sounds like it would be very traumatic for you to be in the courtroom with your abuser. Do you want us to request that you appear by video? Or what do you need? Not even assuming, what would you need in order to feel more comfortable? Maybe they need a support person. Maybe they want to be in the courtroom, even though it makes them anxious. So asking is the first step in making sure that you're providing the correct services. And another thing that I think could help with making sure that services are open to people with disabilities is just making sure that everything is accessible. And Jennifer, it's interesting because you say, we assume things are ADA accessible, and things might be ADA accessible, but still not accessible at all. Especially because I think there is still a very narrow thought of what it means to have a disability as being a person in a wheelchair. So, new courtrooms, new structures are going up. They have very wide hallways, they have big elevators, but how does that help somebody who can't read and isn't able to access the screens that are at the right height for somebody in a wheelchair? So thinking more broadly, and when you make services accessible for people with disabilities, you make them more accessible for everybody. And even just thinking outside of the physical space, but thinking about the materials or the information that we're providing for people, especially in the court system, where it's so confusing. And I've been practicing law for 20 years, and I still find it really hard sometimes to understand the processes and the lingo and the language. And for somebody who has no experience with the court, even somebody who doesn't have a disability, it's really hard. So to the extent we can, speaking with accessible language, making products available in not just a written format. And if it isn't a written format, then making sure that the reading level is sufficient so that more people can understand it. Or, maybe we need videos or a podcast or graphs or other ways so that information can be conveyed. All those can help with providing more accessible services. And Beth, I think you had some other thoughts too.
Mm-hmm. We spend much of our days talking. We are reaching out to as many different groups and individuals as we can, talking and listening. We're reaching out to families to increase awareness of the scope of the problem and the complexities and barriers in getting services. We are speaking to caregivers and caregiver support agencies and state abuse investigators and anyone we can speak to increase awareness. And we're encouraging support survivor providers to reach out to these same individuals and groups. We're working to connect and to break down the divide between disability organizations and people with disabilities and support providers, and increase collaboration and support. We're also working to raise the voice of individuals. And we're doing this not just through our outreach, but through our individual cases, and hoping that from one case and one example in one county will come increased awareness and support and better support for the next survivor with disabilities. And we're also, and sometimes we're seeing that systemic change needs to happen, and that might be through legislative change or policy change or change within individual departments. And so just as often as we are supporting individuals, we're identifying, oh, this is a systemic issue that we'd like to change. So we're trying to do it all at the same time.
Love it. Well, thank you. And I think if there's one thing people take, it's okay to ask. And in fact, it's kind of our responsibility and our duty to ask, right? And having these hard conversations and couching those questions with, and whether they're on an evaluation or an assessment or an intake form, with letting folks know that this is actually for us to be able to serve you as a whole person and accommodate every aspect of who you are. I love that. And I hope that if there's anything that people take from this today is that it's okay to ask. And in fact, you have this obligation to ask. And then it's incumbent upon the person and their comfort level to disclose. But being a truly accessible, and I would say this goes along with being trauma informed, is understanding and appreciating the whole person. So thank you for that. So can you expand on how the legal rights of survivors with disabilities can be enforced in the justice system, right? Like, what are some really simple, reasonable accommodations that can be made to give a person with disability equal access to participate in the legal process? Or, what are some simple practical tips that you've learned for crime victims and survivors with disabilities?
Mm-hmm. I think, Jennifer, it starts with what we're talking about in allowing the person with disabilities to advocate for them, supporting them and advocating for themselves, and in having a voice and in speaking for themselves, and in working with the survivor to create their advocacy plan. That is directed by their needs and their choice.
The only other thought that popped into my mind is to never assume, right? So many disabilities are not visible to the eye. And so to just assume that someone is fully able and has the exact same abilities as you do, is really out of the gate, just is going to create a barrier for the majority of the individuals, the population that we serve. So thank you for that. Where can people learn more about you guys and the great work that you do, and how can they get involved?
We have a website for our project, which is can be accessed through Disability Rights Oregon's website, which is droregon.org. Our project, again, is the Crime Survivor Project. We welcome emails and phone calls, and can share our contact information in writing if you are able to share that widely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And I would encourage anyone out there to reach out if you have questions. There's no question that should be off limits here. If your goal is to create better services and remove barriers and create access, then reach out and educate yourself, right? And then extend that education outward. Any final thoughts from the two of you?
No, we're just happy to be here and help spread the word. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. Really just incredible work that you're doing, important work. Again, those statistics, I'm gonna carry those with me. Those are so much higher than I had originally thought, and I would imagine anyone viewing this would be feeling the same way. So We all have a responsibility to ensure that crime victims are treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. And what NCVLI is really trying to encourage is this concept of asking for rights and ensuring that victims have access to rights. I was excited, we were all excited to see this year's theme really focusing in on equity and access. Because truly as a field, we need to open our doors, but we also need to open our minds to ensure that all of our services are accessible and are appropriate and are available. So again, thank you. And out there, whether you're an attorney, a prosecutor, a judge, a lawmaker, an advocate, an ally, or a survivor yourself, we're encouraging you to ask yourself, what are you doing today to make victims' rights better, to make them more accessible and equitable for all? Thank you again for joining us. This is going to conclude our series for this year. If you want to learn more about the National Crime Victim Law Institute, our registration for annual conference is live right now, so you can go see all the incredible offerings. The conference will be via Zoom this year. It will be remote. So please learn about the conference, learn more about NCVLI at ncvli.org. And until next time, thank you and be safe.